Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to our respected colleagues and guests. Welcome to this month's Ummatics Colloquium. My name is Hannah Aisha and I'm Outreach Coordinator at Ummatics. As always, we're very happy and excited to welcome everybody to today's conversation. This month's colloquium is on a particularly pertinent topic to the broader Ummatic project, namely the role of Muslim minority communities. Far from referring solely to diaspora groups or small factions at the margins of the Muslim world, Muslim minorities make up 22% of Muslims globally. Present in 31 countries, there are also significant Muslim populations in the leading civilizational states or orders of today, namely India, China, and the West. While much attention is given to the Islamophobia faced by Muslim minorities, these communities also possess significant financial, intellectual, and human resources, sometimes more so than their counterparts in Muslim-majority countries. The question then becomes, how best to harness that potential? Nationalist Islams have been the primary vehicle through which minority communities have sought to express their aspirations, but could an ummatic framing posit an alternative? Can minority communities balance tackling immediate local concerns while addressing global challenges in tandem? Yahya Birt tackles these exact questions and more in his first report for Ayan Institute entitled Ummah at the Margins, the Past, Present and Future of Muslim Minorities. Yahya Birt uses his experience of Muslim communities in the UK and global Islamic movements to highlight how Muslim minorities are well placed to play a constructive role as part of a revived global ummah, but that strategies to enhance the freedom and prosperity of Muslim minorities have often been overshadowed by interstate rivalries in the Muslim majority world. He addresses both the threats and opportunities for minority communities and forces us to think about the challenges ahead while learning from the past. How can Muslims once again be a global civilizational force for good? And what positive role can minorities play? We're very grateful to have Yahya present his paper to us today. The full report can, of course, be downloaded from the Ayan Institute website. Yahya Birt is a research director at Ayan Institute and has 20 years of experience in public policy engagement on British Muslim affairs at the community, national, and international level. He is the author of the collected poems of Abdullah Quilliam, published in 2021, and has written a dozen peer-reviewed academic articles on aspects of Muslim life and history in Britain. We also have 3 insightful respondents for today. First, we have Linda Hyoki. Linda is a PhD candidate in Civilization Studies at Ibn Khaldun University in Istanbul. Her thesis focuses on manifestations of anti-Muslim racism in Finland, and specifically Muslim converts' experiences. She works at the European Coalition of Cities Against Racism as the coordinator of the Working Group on Anti-Muslim Racism, which is heavily focused on policy work in local city administrations. She also consults as a freelancer on diverse projects in the fields of anti-discrimination and European Muslim minorities. Our second respondent is Dr. Fatima Regina. Dr. Fatima is a Legacy and Action Research Fellow at the Stephen Lawrence Research Centre at De Montfort University in Leicester. Her work looks at British Bangladeshi Muslims and their changing identifications and perceptions of dress and language. She also has worked as a research assistant at the Institute of Criminology at the University of Cambridge, looking at policing and counterterrorism. And finally, we have Dr. Sadiq Hamid, who is Research Associate at the Ummatics Institute. Dr. Sadiq is also a research fellow at the University of Wales, Trinity St David, and has been actively engaged in Muslim communities for more than 30 years. And prior to transitioning to academia, was a youth and community development professional. He is the author of Sufi Salafis and Islamists, The Contested Ground of British Islamic Activism, published in 2016, and co-author of British Muslims, New Directions in Islamic Thought, Creativity and Activism, published in 2018. So we have an exciting discussion ahead, inshallah. As always, we'll hear from all of our speakers for the first hour, and then we'll move on to our Q&A session for the second hour. So without further ado, I'll hand over to our first speaker. Over to you, Brother Yahya.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I hope you can, how do I make this? Seems to be in the way. Oh, here. Can you see that okay, everybody?
Yes, we can.
Okay. All right. Sorry. So, do you see that as a full screen? Sorry, I just want to make sure. As you still
Not yet.
see? Oh, okay.
Did you press from beginning, perhaps?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, is that
Oh.
instant?
Oh dear.
Hang on a second.
Do you have two screens? It might be because of the
Yeah, that what I've done, I've just unplugged the other screen. Let me try that
share the other
again.
one, yeah.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's better. Yeah.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
Okay. So, Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I'm very honored to be invited to the Ummatics colloquium. I regard this as one of the most promising intellectual endeavors by Muslim intellectuals in the minority context, coming together and networking globally to think about our collective future. So I'm very honored to be part of this discussion, and I'm confident that inshallah the Ummatics Institute will go from strength to strength and will produce work of great merit and insight that will help all of us think and dream and plan about better futures, inshallah. This is the this is the kind of a scoping report that we wrote. So for the Ayan Institute, it's conceptual scoping report, and it does some empirical work. Today, I'm just going to summarize some themes from the report, but I won't be able to cover everything because it's such a wide-ranging report. If you, as Hannah said earlier, if you really have to read the report, I think to get a better idea of it. So my purpose here today is just to give you some take-homes really from the report, inshallah. So, sorry, why is that not letting me click? All right, okay. So just briefly, the Ayan Institute was established in 2021. We started in lockdown, and our vision is to see, a Muslim world that is united, independent, strong, prosperous, free of war and conflict, and capable of resolving its own issues. And that vision is set out with sort of 12 key major action points and streams that then goes from, intellectual life, economics, civilizational renewal, institutional renewal, and so on, intrafaith, building global networks, and so on. And there are various aspects to our streams, to our work. Muslim minorities is one of those streams, and so as building from this first paper, we wanted to, this is what my report is part of this sort of journey of the Ayan Institute's work. We are a think tank. We're not an academic institute, so most think tanks, our work is focused towards recommendations rather than conclusions at the end of each report. I should also say that we are not state-facing. That's quite an important point. We don't primarily direct our reports to states per se. We direct them towards the Ummah, and we direct it really towards Ummah development, and really focusing much more on sort of building the sinews of the bones and the sinews of the Ummah. So I guess you could describe that as Ummah facing or community facing. So the kind of this report, which came out in October, the key conceptual approaches. One is Muslim minority, but minority here is not a normative concept here. It's as we say, I look at the term critically in the report, but obviously it's a key reality that we have 1 in 5 Muslims has to deal with. So there's no escaping the term minority, but the report does try to have some critical purchase upon that term. Second key concept is politics of Ummah. What does that mean? Beyond as kind of something to be afraid of or cynical of, how do we think about politics of Ummah normatively and analytically when it comes to Muslim minorities? And the third thing really is looking at hard and soft Islamic power. So I made an attempt to desecularize the division made by Joseph Nye between hard and soft power, to also bring back in an Islamic normative element. But the reason why I wanted to focus on power is because very often Muslim minorities are scared to think and talk out aloud about power, partly because we have internalized Islamophobic narratives about our own low value, and so we can only see our weaknesses, and we can't make a sober adjudication of our power and how we stand in the world and what is within our grasp, what is it within our ability to do if we come together and we build and collaborate. So in this scoping report, we wanted to ask some big questions, because as I said, we're just trying to set out a kind of framework for a discussion. And this is not, let me stress, this is not, we are not pretending this is some kind of conversation ender. This is a conversation starter. So these big questions are perennial questions for all of us. Why does Muslim solidarity matter in the world? Why do Muslim minorities matter with regard to the wider ummah? You know, what overall conclusions can we draw about the condition of Muslim minorities today? What is distinct about politics of ummah for Muslim minorities as opposed to other kinds of politics like diasporic politics or nationalist politics? What are the goals of politics of ummah for Muslim minorities? What goals should we set ourselves? How do Muslim minorities empower themselves? What is Islamic hard and soft power? What obstacles impede the politics of ummah for Muslim minorities? So these are all big open-ended questions. The report makes a go at trying to answer them, but as I said, I can't discuss all of these today. But do go look at the report, and maybe, you know, it's, as I said, it's a conversation starter, the report, and that's the intention. It's meant to provoke a sober debate on these questions. So the key proposition in this report is simply this: that solidarity for our ummah will thrive when we connect together and empower the minority Muslim world and the majority Muslim world together. That's a central proposition that the report is making. And let me now go on and try to unpack that a little bit. So as Hannah mentioned at the top of this, 1 in 5 Muslims in the world, over 22%, lives as minorities. Over half of them are in one country, India, which has the world's 2nd largest Muslim population. And you know, we've done a big data survey of 31 Muslim minorities that have populations of over 1 million. So here you can see, you know, very broadly, the green is obviously the core with Muslim majority countries, but the orange highlights where the 31 Muslim minorities are located. Let's try to break down those minorities a little bit further. So using a big data analysis through some data sets that we interrogated, we ended up breaking up these 31 minorities into 3 groups. One is the big 3: India, China, Russia. All of these are great geopolitical powers. They're all nuclear powers. They're all economic powers. They carry geopolitical weight. They all have large and historic, of long-standing minorities that they themselves have been great contributors to Islamic culture and civilization. And they all pose, all of the minorities in these 3 countries are, you know, facing, you know, either considerable pressure or even a threat to their very survival in some cases. So untying the knot, trying to do something about the welfare of these 3 minorities, we suggest in the report, is actually key. It is actually of global import for the entire ummah and the world at large. It matters tremendously globally what happens to India's 200 million plus Muslims under Hindutva, under Hindu nationalism. The second group are the Africa 14. So they have, collectively a population of over 100 million. What the big data set shows is okay, that it goes from middle income countries like South Africa to some of the poorest countries in the world like Mozambique. But across the board, these 14 countries, all of them have high levels of religious freedom. And maybe that would suggest actually they can we could take the example of Ghana, a Muslim majority country, an OIC member that took Myanmar to the International Court in 2019 to have the Rohingya genocide, Rohingya ethnic cleansing recognized in international law as a genocide. The third group is the Western Nine. And all of these are new 20th century minorities, with the exception of Bosnia, where Islam dates back to the 16th century. But all of them have relatively high income and relatively high levels of freedom. And although they only number about 30 million, maybe they punch above their weight, their demographic weight. This is a kind of one of the big data sets. So we matched against individual purchasing parity power by national rank versus specifically state discrimination against religious minorities. So with these 31 Muslim minorities, this gives us a kind of analytical division. It also happens that there tends to be a little bit of geographical logical coherence to these three groups as well. But more importantly, when we measure state discrimination against religious minorities versus personal wealth, we find these quite striking patterns here. This is just using a Pearson's correlation to kind of against two data sets. One is the Human Freedom Index that uses 82 measures of civic and political and economic freedoms against state discrimination against religious minorities. And what this shows is little to no correlation between the two. So that's in other words, it shows that more freedom overall in the society does not mean the religious freedoms of Muslim minorities will be protected. So we have to fight for them where they are threatened. In other words, religious freedoms of Muslim minorities need their own attention. And so it's not always obvious. In other words, the assumption that if you raise all freedoms, that religious freedoms of Muslim minorities will automatically also be protected. So this is the slide I'm most nervous about presenting in this august forum, because I am not a theologian, okay? But the report does do some theoretical work. Building on actually thinking about the previous discussion that Ummatics Forum had with Daryl Lee, Ummah is a post-West analytical and normative concept. So I'm advocating that we not only need to work it as a normative concept, but think about Ummah as an analytical concept. And I'm thinking specifically here of diaspora. So diaspora originally was applied to the Jewish experience of exile from homeland and dispersal. But diaspora in academia has become an analytical concept applied to all sorts of transnational ethnic formations that cross borders. So why could not Ummah also work analytically? And the reason why we need Ummah as an analytical concept is because we need to look at how it's operating in the real world and play that back against our normative conceptions of Ummah at the same time. The second thing is that, I would say we need a double political theology for Muslim majority and minority worlds, because we are tasked, from our tradition, we are tasked with looking at what would ideal governance look like in a society that Muslims run. But we don't really ask the question enough, what would an ideal society look like where a Muslim minority could thrive, not just survive? And so I think we need to think about that question too, normatively and not just pragmatically. In the report, we set up a kind of critical dialogue between Ummah and other ancillary concepts, nation state, minority, diaspora, and universalism. And so, drawing broadly on the tradition, Ummah is an unbordered, another way to say that is post-national, unbordered, ethical concept centered on Quranic faith and justice, but also as a multi-confessional pact based on consultation and mutual security. And obviously that is leaning on the Quran verses relating to the Muhammadan Ummah, but also to the Pact of Medina. So in the third section of the report, we go on to look at the distinction between Islamic soft and hard power. And summarizing that discussion, the definition that I came up with is that soft power for Muslim minorities specifically is embodying Islamic virtues in our cultural, social, intellectual, and political life by word and by example. And in other words, that our Islamic virtues or Islamic values should not be seen as something sequestered to the core institutions of Muslim minority life, family, mosque, madrasa. It shouldn't be confined to these institutions, but it should be visible and obvious by word and most importantly by example, because in the prophetic dispensation, you know, virtue is known by word, by intention, word, and by deed, by acting righteously in the world. So ultimately, this is what soft persuasive or soft power ultimately consists of, is embodying the Sunnah. But it's not all about soft power. I mean, we go on to suggest in the report that soft power is underemphasized for Muslim minorities, and we need to think a lot more about how we can strengthen that. And there are some practical measures in the report around that. The other is hard power. So hard power, coercive power for Muslim minorities. There's more here than we might think. One I would suggest, and this is sort of slightly kicking against Joseph Nye's original distinction between the two, is civil disobedience, withdrawal of consent against discriminatory policies that directly discriminate against Muslims. But also, as economic power is part of Nye's definition of hard power, the promotion of trade, remittances which are much more economically important and politically important than either foreign direct investment or development aid. So remittances do a lot more work and are a lot bigger than either of those other two. And also for our philanthropy and the transfer of skills and expertise locally and globally. So echoing back to my point about we need to think through what is the Islamic political theology for Muslim minorities. You know, let me come at it from the other angle. You know, under conditions, and this is assuming here we're not talking minorities where Muslims are being crushed, like they are being crushed in China or increasingly being crushed in India. But we're talking here where Muslim minorities have some agency still, that they have some room for maneuver and free. They live in democracies. So I would argue that, you know, democracy in the West, for instance, is being hollowed out by oligarchy and finance capitalism. We need to go back to what John King calls the monetary democracy, a fuller democracy, so that, you know, it's not, you know, political parties and lobbying systems are not really bought out by big money. The second thing is that I believe that we have to work towards peaceful, deeply pluralistic societies. And by this, I mean by deeply plural, I mean something that is not beyond the liberal conception of pluralism. So in other words, you know, it's pluriversal. In other words, you agree that in a society you could have people with radically different conceptions of the good life, and yet the framework is there for them to live peacefully and in cooperation with each other. For Muslim minorities, the fear is that they're being forcibly assimilated into a liberal idea of pluralism, which actually gives them very little room to breathe. The third point is that anti-Islamophobia should be central to anti-racism. The reason why I say that is because I think that in an age of rising ethno-nationalism, anti-racism is the coming struggle for Muslim minorities. and therefore the figure of the Muslim has to be central to anti-racism today. But I argue in the report that it has to be anti-racism 2.0. It has to be post-secular. It has to incorporate Muslim subjectivities, and it cannot be a kind of secular anti-racism by fiat of anti-racism organizing and traditions in the West. And obviously, echoing the fourth point, echoing back to my earlier slide, you know, Muslim minority rights in particular need special attention. So how am I doing for time, Hannah? How much time have I got?
You've got about 5-6 minutes. 5 minutes.
Okay. Right. So I'm a bit of a history buff, and I thought it would be really cool to go back and look at 130 years of Muslim community organizing in the West. And I realized there's a kind of British-centric, Westo-centric element here to my report. I admit that. But the way I look at it is, if we think of how do we build Ummah solidarity as a shared problem, space, and opportunity, we are coming at this opportunity from a variable geometry. So my geometry happens to come from the West and happens to come from Britain. But if we're going to make this a global Ummahtic conversation, we're all going to be coming from some kind of starting point. But anyway, this is me reflecting critically on community building practice coming out of America and Europe, but with one example from Africa, from East Africa as well. So there are 10 steps, it seems to me, to build stronger Muslim minorities. The first 3 of these really are saying the same thing, but importantly different ways, or interestingly different ways. The first is obvious: build transnational alliances. But number 2, champion your cause to the Ummah, make your cause Ummatic. The best example I've often thought is Malcolm X. So Malcolm X, in the last few years of his life, he makes the cause of Black America an Ummatic cause. He goes to the Middle East and through Africa, in places like the UK and elsewhere, and makes his cause an Ummatic cause. The third is the paradox of our life today, that we know we are local. We act locally, we think globally. We think locally and we act globally. You know, we look after our neighbors, but we also look out for the Ummah at large. And so how we walk that line is always a political challenge of our age. Then, you know, the rest of it is sort of practical steps: building independent institutions, separate to protect your political and religious sectors, build alliances and coalitions locally, empower your community materially and spiritually. Don't have a hollowed out notion of power that will create an oxymoronic thing like secular Islamism. And I see signs of secular Islamism all over the place at the moment in the West, and I'm deeply worried about it. So we have to go back to a non-secular idea of power when we talk about empowerment. 8, if we're not going to fall into postmodernism, we have to remember Islam as universal call. We have to keep calling to Islam. To call Islam a universal message is the most subversive thing we can do at the moment. But it's also true, like Abraham, we have to smash the idols of our forefathers. We have no choice but to remember that we are supposed to uphold the universal call in a pluriversal world. Muslims should be at the heart of community leadership at every level. The reason why I say this is because in my 30 years of community life and organizing, I can tell you that every time I've worked in a community organization where Muslim women are equal partners, we create far better leadership, much more holistic, that looks at problems from every angle, and we make solutions that go from the top to the bottom of our communities. And unless we, you know, if we don't do that, we'll have one-eyed leadership. I'm certain of it. But there are many examples the report gives where, you know, where Muslim women have led the way on this. And the 10th point is we've got to emphasize soft power. We've actually got to train up our community. We've got to support our own creators, our cultural expression. you know, we've got to, many creators, Muslim creators have to go outside of the community for support. So is it any surprise that they're now performing for the liberal white gaze? If we support our creators, then they can tell our stories and expand the definition of what it means to be human in the liberal society. I think this is very, very important to embrace the non-liberal and to humanize the non-liberal, if I can put it that way. And media skills, we're in the middle of a digital revolution. We need to update our media skills every 18 months because there's always a new platform. So we need to put resources into this. So the goal, to conclude, the goal, really, what is it that we'd like? What is the way that we move towards this? Because the Ayan Institute is about the next sort of 3 steps, not necessarily the next 20. So the next 3 steps is this: foster independent spaces for borderless Umatic networks to build solidarity, because solidarity is not an infinite resource. It's not something you take for granted. It's not something that's just on tap for free. We actually have to nurture Ummah solidarity in each generation. So we have to build solidarity, knowledge, expertise, and capacity that models post-national global solidarity for humanity at large, which after all faces planetary challenges like the climate crisis. So if, as Hannah said at the top of this, if we plug in all the major world civilizations into the Islamic core successfully, we are modeling solidarity for humanity in the name of our faith. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brother Yahya, and for keeping so well to time. I will come back to you actually just for 5 minutes after the respondents, just if you want to respond to any direct points. But now, inshallah, we'll move on to our respondents. Each respondent has about 10 minutes to say their piece. I also just wanted to remind our general audience of the chat box function and the Q&A box function, such that if anybody has questions during the presentation, you can put them in the Q&A box. And if you would like to just generally comment on a particular point someone has made, then please do feel free to use the chat box function as well. But thank you so much. We'll go then to our next, to our first respondent, our next speaker, Sister Linda.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you, Brother Yahya, for presenting your report. I was very happy to see that this sort of a report was published. I mentioned about this also in social media already, because I think that in general, the consideration that Muslim minorities generally get when we're talking about the Muslim world is very scarce. I would like to actually look into the 5th key question of the report that you mentioned, and this was about the challenges that impede the politics of Ummah in general. In a way, I would like to connect this question to the phenomenon of Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism. I personally prefer anti-Muslim racism, but that's a whole nother discussion for itself, I think. And the construction of the good Muslim and the bad Muslim within our, let's say, European contexts, because that's from which perspective I can actually speak, since I'm from Finland and I have lived in Europe for all my life. So this problematic construction of the good Muslim and the bad Muslim, talking from my perspective as a Finnish Muslim convert, I see it's manifested in this kind of a competition between the different communities within the minority. There is this kind of a competition between who is, so to say, the most deserving Muslim minority within the national context. When we're talking about, for instance, resources or the voice that you may get when we are talking about politics and issues related to our rights, related to cooperation with the government. And this is also something that I have been working within my PhD thesis, as I have been looking into the way how Muslim converts in Finland are perceived. And I have actually contrasted the perception of Muslim converts in Finland, and specifically, I'm talking about in this case of white converts, with the minority of Tatars in our country. So the Tatars, they have a very we could say a long-standing presence in Finland. They came to the country in the 19th century. And they have ever since lived in Finland and been part and parcel of the society. But they are a very specific community within the Muslim minority because they are very small, and they are also linguistically bound to each other. They are about 500 to 600 individuals only, and they only have a couple of congregations. Now, they are phenotypically something that we could also call white Muslims. And it has been very interesting to see how they are perceived, let's say, in the political debates around Islam and, let's say, Muslim practices in Finland, as well as also in the media, but also the way how they present themselves. There is this very interesting phenomenon of calling the Tatar Muslims Finnishized Muslims. Now, this is a translation from the Finnish language that I have tried to master. The word that was used in the Finnish language was something specific. So Finnishized Muslims. And this refers to the so-called integration expectation that the government, that the majority society have towards Muslims in general. Now, what do we mean by this Finnishized Muslims or Tatars being Finnishized Muslims? It's not about the fact that they hold the passport or they are living as such in Finland, or, you know, but there are these representations about their way of living Islam. And it is taken kind of as a reference point to how other Muslims should also live their Islam and practice Islam within the Finnish context. Now, some might say that they are secularized Muslims. This is the idea of secularism is not something that I am very much of an expert on, so that is something I don't want to dwell too much into. But oftentimes it's about visibility. As I already mentioned, due to the phenotypes, they can actually pass as white people. They can actually pass just like a majority population because they are actually not Muslims of color. And in fact, they barely, let's say, wear visible marks of their religious identity. Let's say they don't wear headscarves, the women, or the men don't wear kufia or jalabiya or anything like this. So, as I said, they are taken as the reference point for the other Muslims. And this happens in media representations, but also in political rhetorics. They are in the research literature also called something like the government, the partners of the government, or Muslims that have been keeping a low profile about themselves, and so on and so forth. And I also have to mention that Tatars in general in Europe, it's not just that there are Tatars in Finland, there are also Tatars in other countries in Europe, in Poland, in Lithuania, and also in Estonia. And it has been, other research has also shown that these groups, these Tatar groups, they oftentimes kind of enter into this competition with, let's say, immigrant Muslim groups. And they are pretty detrimentally, as I would say, called indigenous Muslims of each national context, which has its own connotation, I think. And it's always about like, who is the more deserving to be considered as somebody that has a right to speak about Islam. Now, of course, anybody is free to live their Islam as they want. I'm not trying to here somehow criticize the way of any Muslim, how they practice their religion or how they choose to live their lives. That's not the point. The point is that the way how these kind of dynamics within the minority setting are instrumentalized for the purpose of anti-Muslim racist discourse in general. And this is done externally, and this is done internally. So when I'm saying that externally, it's obviously the non-Muslim majority population and mostly politicians who are using these dynamics against, let's say, immigrant Muslims, but also these minorities themselves. So you were talking about protecting Muslim minority rights, for instance, like this is an imperative that we have to take in order to kind of like achieve this ummatic approach or the ummatic mentality.
Sorry, Sister Linda, just to let you know, just 2.5 minutes.
2.5 minutes, yes, sure, I have a timer. I'm going to finish with this, yes. So the reason that I chose to actually give this example is that when there is, I'm not so sure how we can achieve this kind of like ummatic mentality and solidarity to fight for these minority rights, or let's say the rights of the Muslims within each national context, when there is this kind of a conflict within our communities. There was, for instance, a very recent statement by the former chairman of the Tatar community in Finland about headscarves. And he basically threw all the Muslim women under the bus who are wearing the headscarf by stating that this has no religious foundation and it is a statement against integration. So my question is for this colloquium and for my colleagues, is that when we're talking about minority politics, or actually ummatic politics, we are thinking about maybe the ummah as a global body, but we should maybe also start very small and talk about the ummah in each national context first, and start with the smaller unities, because I'm afraid that we are taking a too big of a slice of the cake when we start to, look further than our own backyards. So in that sense, this is my response to the report and to this discussion as a promptus. And I hope that I'm going to get some ideas from you and motivate for further discussion, everybody, the participants and the other panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sister Linda, and you kept beautifully to time as well. We'll go on then to our next respondent, inshallah, Dr. Fatima. Whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. And firstly, thank you, Hannah and Uthman and everyone else behind the scenes who organized this and for the invite. And also, Yahya Baya and I have been thinking about a lot of these things for a few months now. We were on a panel a few weeks ago where we tried to discuss similar things. So I've timed my response. It's about 9 minutes, so I'm hoping I can stick to the 9 minutes. So I finished reading the report, and these were some of the things that stood out for me that I was hoping to share, and some questions I had. So I'd like to start by noting how much I appreciated the hopeful tone of the report and that it wasn't all doom and gloom. Whilst noting this, there was a recognition that there has been a loss of hope, and I wonder how much of it is actually down to perhaps Muslims living as minorities in non-Muslim majority countries. The hope placed on imagining of the Ummah as pluralist and not revolving around assimilation was an important point to draw upon, because so often Muslims as minorities find themselves caught up in a lot of assimilationist discourses to meet the demands of the nation state's relations to its Muslims, or in other contexts is to push for integration, with much of the work being put on the minorities, including Muslims. And so the defining of Ummah as being in an active state rather than passive is an important intervention here, because at times it seems it is treated as such, that it's just a passive entity we respond to from our localities. Whereas I appreciated that within the report, Yahya was encouraging us to think of it as an active space and an active, something we should actively be sort of participating in. Although one bit of the argument that made me wonder the most was particularly the point relating to the Ummah being tied to the mother, is how we reconcile some of the disturbing developments around gender relations in these Muslim minority contexts, and how it won't, I believe, bode well for Muslim women. We have also seen, if need be, to specifically look at the post 9/11 context, that Muslim women became the fodder everyone played with for so long, including justifying military interventions, that this emphasis on ummah relating to mother brings forth the question, what political work is this doing? And I understand from an etymological point of view that, you know, ummah is related to mother and sort of its breakdown, but how do we tread cautiously so as not to repeat how the very nation states that we're critiquing and how they define themselves vis-a-vis the woman, where the nation ends up representing the woman, how do we ensure we're not replicating that and talking about the woman needing protecting here? So how do we ensure that we don't find ourselves within those same colonial entrapments and understandings of the nation state? There were a few other moments in the report that stood out for me I'd like to focus on. So on page 12, there was a line declaring that we are entering a post-West world in which Eurocentrism no longer dominates as it once did, which I found particularly intriguing. I'd contend here that just because Europe or the West is not the center of attention or has any sort of monopoly on power, it does not therefore mean its entrenching of modern ideas have not permeated into other societies. And one such example is through the use of its economic models and replicating those models in many Muslim majority countries. Eurocentrism can certainly exist without Europe or the West holding such powers. I appreciated the part in the report about how the focus ought to be on self-actualization being the basis for moving forward rather than seeking external validation. Now, this is a valid point and one I have always sought to incorporate into my own work, so a reminder of this was necessary. However, often us non-Black Muslims draw from the indomitable work of Malcolm X, and rightly so, but at times we fail to come to terms with our own shortcomings of who ends up constituting the Ummah. It's not to say we shouldn't draw from his works and his contribution and how he insisted on never seeking that external validation, and there's much to be learned from the way he resisted. But in the process of doing this, let's not lose sight of how we end up perpetuating specific racial boundaries within the construct of the Ummah. And I think perhaps considering today's space would also be important to consider who is in this and who is omitted. So the most refreshing part was including references to Muslims outside of the MENA region and for us to consider and widen our imagination of the Ummah into other areas. Hence why I appreciated the bit where Yahya Bai shares how some Muslim minorities outsize Muslim majority nations. So for example, India has more than Nigeria or Egypt combined, Ethiopia more than Saudi Arabia, China more than Syria, Tanzania more than Somalia, and Russia more than Tunisia. I think this tends to happen because of the way within the Muslim communities, we also recreate hierarchies and stratify along race lines, with anything related to the MENA region at the top, followed by some references to the Indian subcontinent. So I appreciated reading more about Muslim minorities' experiences in countries across the continent of Africa and how Muslims fare comparatively better economically in countries such as South Africa, Ghana, and Ivory Coast. I mention these racial hierarchies because often they are then replicated within the very institutions recommended by Yahya Bai we ought to consider setting up to push back and have a central voice in demanding better for Muslims. This will be one of the biggest hindrances to Muslim minorities if we do not recognize how, while pursuing our own self-actualization, that we don't also end up imitating the colonial framings around race. Raising the community's racial literacy will be for our own benefit, not our demise. I know religion is sometimes a fallback here, that our Prophet ﷺ's last sermon disparaged such tendencies. And there is the sort of reference that no Arab is over on an Arab, but we know that there is one thing that takes place in theory and another we see in practice, or rather never see in practice. I think the most surprising part for me in the report was how by 2050, India will likely have the largest Muslim population in the world, superseding Indonesia. I appreciated that Yahya Bai addressed how we cannot pit the strategic interests of Muslims in majority settings with those of minority settings because they come with their own issues. So while thinking of India as an example, I think it is imperative to keep in mind the current events unfolding there and the abuse of Indian Muslims by the Indian state. I know in people's imagination of the subcontinent, we usually think of Pakistan and Bangladesh as having large Muslim populations, but India is a nation we need to keep a close eye on with a current fascist government in power. In addition to this, I also noted the provocation in the report of considering Jammu and Kashmir within the wider marginalizing of Indian Muslims as an imperative point. Now, before concluding, I wanted to focus in specifically on one point raised in the report multiple times. I was very happy to see that there was a strong suggestion that there ought to be a new development of anti-racism that is not secular. This reminded me of the works of Anandi Ramamurthy in the British context, who worked on and continues to work on the Asian youth movements. Now, for the non-Brits in the room, Asian in the British context usually refers to South Asians. And Anandi Ramamurthy, in her work looking at Asian youth movements of the 70s and 80s, in her book, The Black Star, pretty much concludes that one of the reasons why these Asian youth movements were successful because they were secular. That's not to say, that it wasn't a significant variable at the time, but I think right now we are in absolute dire need of theorizing how such a movement now, in its contemporary manifestation, has to factor in the role of religion. There is no denying that more and more Muslims are involved in the specific space, as addressed by Yahya Bai, but there needs to be an acknowledgement that it is still a secular space with religion operating on the margins, sometimes just about on the margins. Now, within this, the recent obsession with representational politics and how that has become a potent domain for people seeking change has been the bane of my life. So when I saw Yahya's reference in the report, how we need to de-emphasize this particular hollow form of politics is something I definitely welcome and encourage all of us to disseminate within the spaces we find ourselves in. So it functions to keep us distracted and will certainly not be the domain through which we achieve any of the things recommended in the report. Last but not least, I was grateful to see British Muslims used as a case study and how you did not shy away from being quite honest here about the political dimensions the young people have to deal with, especially the reference to the Uncle Gs and how they have very much dominated so much of Labour politics on a local level that makes it near impossible for anyone to push back against it. And just to raise the point regarding representational politics here in the UK, where we have a South Asian Prime Minister now, is not going to get us anywhere whose family have intimate ties to the Modi government. And on page 47, the reference to things we're not paying attention to here is also necessary. I appreciated how you nudged towards a low academic achievement amongst Muslim boys here in the UK, which I think is something that sadly hasn't actually been picked up by many. And also the fact that there hasn't been much attention paid to the Muslim refugee crisis. There has been an overall attention to the refugee crisis, but not specifically considering how a large portion of those arriving are Muslims. Having said that, and maybe I am biased here, I do see a whole new generation of British Muslims who do not hold back, and that within Europe, I do see British Muslims stand a much bigger chance of bringing about a scale of change not accessible to Muslims in mainland European countries simply because of the limitations they are having to confront in their respective countries. However, in this process, we have to be careful not to domesticate Islam, which is something repeated multiple times in the report. And just to conclude, I very much appreciated a lot of these interventions, provocations. My only direct criticism I have of the report for Yahya Bai is on page 39, you had an image of a masjid, and it was from a masjid declared to be in Israel. So I was just wondering perhaps what would be Ayan Institute's position on this in citing Israel as a location where there is a masjid and not the use of, particularly when one of the sort of concerns is to try and avoid sort of colonial entrapments, and this is a particular settler colonial project. So how do you reconcile that? So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Fatima. Okay, we'll head over to our last respondent, Dr. Siddique. When you're ready, inshallah, the floor is yours.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you very much to colleagues here at Humanities Institute, and thank you to Ayan Institute and Yahya for writing this report. For me, I actually was very keen to see this report when it came out, and I read it pretty much the first day. I think it's such an important contribution to an area which really hasn't been theorized or analyzed in a pragmatic way. What I think is groundbreaking about this intervention is that it's not only a piece of analysis, but it's a call to action, and it has actionable policy outcomes. I think there's so much in it, it's so rich, and it really it forces us to think about a number of issues which Yahya has already highlighted, and other respondents have focused on. I mean, what I'd like to do in my brief response is just to reflect on the questions he's asked, particularly I think in terms of recommendations and conclusion. And I'm taking a very practical perspective here, somebody who shares this concern around translating ideas into action. And as I think most of us know who work in academia and those of us who have policy experience, there's always a disconnect between, the analytical aspects of describing phenomena or particular challenges and issues. And I mean, certainly in my experience, I think, it's great that we have analysis, but often in Muslim communities and communities generally, there is a gap. Reports are written frequently, policy documents are formulated, but for me, the bottom line is what happens next? Where is the action? Where is the implementation? And I think it's a very easy report to read, and it is I think one of its strengths is that it is accessible to not only academics and policymakers. I think activists and any concerned layperson should be able to follow the arguments, and the whole point of it, I think, as Yahya's mentioned, it's to stimulate thought. It's a think piece. It's to get us thinking, and it's really for us as a community, a collective ummah, and especially us in the minorities settings, to then think, well, okay, well, what do we do next? So I'm going to take a very much a kind of layperson's perspective on this, reading this, putting my academic analysis aside. I'm really interested to know how then do we overcome the barriers, the very real barriers to the implementation of some of these reports on a very practical level. I mean, let's start off with the UK, the country I know best, and Yahya obviously, and others. We are dealing. Every community has its particular histories and complications and challenges and issues. And as hopeful as the report is, I think when it comes down to it, the bottom line is, how do we get people to engage with these ideas? How do we get people to think about this analysis, and then think, okay, well, what do I take away, and how can I implement some of these things and start developing? And I think obviously there are limitations. Yahya's not going to be able to answer all of that. He's inviting us to have this collective conversation and come up with the answers. But I am interested in the obvious things around overcoming the political and sectarian kind of roadblocks. In many cases, there are political interests. There are both at the local level, at the national level, and the international also impinges on the British context as well, as we know. But there are some just practical considerations. I mean, how do you overcome apathy? How do you, how are you able to navigate skepticism and a general feeling of exhaustion and demoralization, which is very prevalent? I mean, there's for me, from my own perspective and analysis, I think we have both a sense of feeling overwhelmed by all that's going on in the Muslim world, and what is going on here for us in the UK and wherever we live. We are preoccupied with our individual context, but what the report does is invite us to think globally, as he says, to start building and to address the issues in our local community, but keep an eye on what is going on globally. But in looking at our local situation, how do we move on from the status quo that is very often deeply embedded and difficult, really? And I think that's the conversation we need to be having now between us. And I'd love to hear from Yahya in terms of what he has, the feedback he's received, actually, because he has been able to get a number of different platforms to engage with the report. I'd be interested to hear from him about what the different audiences have been saying to his report. I know he has been engaging with academics and activists in particular, but I'd be interested to know if any traditional scholars had managed to read the report yet. And I think really, we certainly here in English speaking platforms have been, he's been getting some good coverage of it, but I'd wondered if any of the other major minority communities that he has highlighted have engaged with the report yet. Because for me, at the end of the day, it is about engagement. It's about then moving forward. And what I wouldn't want, and I don't think any of us here, and certainly not Yahya, is then this to be, discussed for a couple of weeks and then a couple of months, and then we forget about it and nothing changes. And this has always been a kind of like a weakness that we have in our communities. We move on to the next thing. What Yahya has done is actually getting us to think about things in a proactive manner, learning from the past, understanding the present, but really challenging us to think about the future, to envision something better. And I think that's the hard work. If we want something better, how do we now move on and walk those steps that he's talked about? Step 1, step 2, step 3. Great. I mean, he's invited us to walk on this journey. But I'm very much interested in how we then now take this valuable document and that translate it into an accessible way into our communities and engaging with our thought leaders, our communities, our scholars, our concerned members of the community, and then really start working on this. I mean, he's listed so many suggestions that are contemporary and that draws on different disciplines, but he's also asked us to learn from the recent past and certainly in the British context. So for me, I'm very much appreciate what he's done, and I think all of us, I think if you haven't read the report yet, you need to read the report. It should stimulate and ideas and hopefully push us towards thinking about and thinking through what we do next. And it's what we do next really what I'm interested in. And I hope Yahya may be able to respond to some of the feedback that share some of the feedback that he's had so far since he's released the report. And I look forward to hearing from him, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Siddique. Okay, just before we go to the Q&A session, I'm going to come back to you, Brother Yahya. Just if I can give you just literally 3 minutes to respond to any of the points that have been raised by the respondents.
Oh,
So
okay.
just 3
Wow.
minutes.
Okay, so I'll try my best. I think, okay, so I would push back a little bit on your question, Linda, to say that, we must sort out our internal problems first before we think about the Ummah. And what I would want to suggest is that actually, one of the suggestions in the report is that you can make your cause ummatic. So if you have rights issues that are particularly concerned in Finland, you could find allies outside by saying this is an ummatic cause. In other words, don't feel isolated, don't isolate yourselves. Maybe you can receive support elsewhere from other minorities and so on. So this is one of the big lessons of the past. When Muslims organized as minorities, they didn't isolate themselves. So, I'd really recommend you not to kind of have this sequential idea of politics in your mind. The art is to try and, for me, the lesson of history is to try and do both at the same time. Think locally, act globally, or grammatically, act locally, think globally. It's about how we walk that line is the political challenge of our generation. This is what I'm trying to say. This is our challenge, how we walk that walk. If we say we won't walk that walk, then I think we won't have an ummah. We'll just be minorities everywhere, and that will be the end of the story. So I think that's a critical point for me personally. Fatima, thank you so much for such a careful reading of the report. I don't think I can answer all of your points, but let me try and answer one, which is about the a lack of self-critique means that politics of Ummah would reproduce coloniality and gender, or for instance, in negative gender dynamics. So entirely agree that, you know, it has to be a self-critical practice. I mean, I do nod towards this in the report, talking about what I believe to be kind of productive frames of thinking that are emerging amongst Muslim intellectuals. But obviously I don't go into detail, but yes, and I completely agree. I also agree that it's so important to have this discussion about what I call anti-secularism 2.0, and I hope that that would be part of one of the projects that Ayan Institute would take forward. I'd love to have you involved in that discussion. Maybe a handbook or something on anti-racism, something like that, that would be accessible. You know, so anyway, you know, a kind of non-secular anti-racism, including like Islamic sources in there and things like that. Who knows what could be done there. To Sadiq, yeah, we've had a range of responses to the report. I've given the report to various ulama, but I've not really had any detailed responses yet, although one alim is going to review it and write an article. So let's see how that works out. I think that tackling apathy and skepticism, I think that we have to recognize the problem of apathy and demoralization and being overwhelmed, and we have to address it directly. I do talk about this in the report. I do talk about the fact that politics of Ummah has been mobilized by religious nationalism, by nation states pushing Islamic soft power, or Jamaats, transnational Jamaats, for their own reasons, sometimes utilize politics of Ummah for membership drives, fundraising drives, you know, and so on. And so it's right, like any ideal, it can be used for all sorts of purposes. And what all I'm calling for is a kind of a self-critical reflection that we have to weed out, I would call it sort of cheap uses of ummatic solidarity, and we have to try and recover its ethical heart core. That's why I mentioned, you know, I spend some time talking about concept of ummah as an ethical concept. It's not a bordered concept, you know, when we go back to tradition, then we can revive ourselves. That's how we revive ourselves. We remember what's important, and we go back to the world and we try to make a difference. But it's right that concepts get worn down by realpolitik. We have to recognize that, and we have to name it, shame it, and move on and revive ourselves. So there's no like way around that. Yes, the report has lots of suggestions. We all have to drill down and make our own solutions collectively. That's not entirely, but Ayan is interested. I mean, I'd love to do a project on core funding minority Islams, you know. So get business people together, people who want Awqaf and foundations. There's some great combines that bring together business with foundations to do work. So we could maybe fund more of our own youth work, or we could fund our creatives. There's a lot we could do. So yes, I know I'm being positive in a time of universal despair, but you know, faith only flies on the wings of hope and fear together. Anyway, I'm being waved at by Hannah, so my time is up.
No, thank you so much, Brother Yahya. I think there was a lot to respond to, but you did an admirable job. With that, though, I do want to move on to the Q&A session so we can have almost an hour to bring in everybody else into the conversation. So we'll open the floor now to questions and comments. For our panelists, our colloquium members, feel free to raise your hand, and I will do my best to come to you, and you can address your questions to any members of the panel that we have with us today. Similarly, attendees, you can also raise your hand and request to unmute yourself and pose your questions directly, or of course, you can use the Q&A box. So as it seems no panelists wish to ask questions just yet, we'll go to a couple of questions that were submitted, some written questions that were submitted in the Q&A box during the presentations. So I'm assuming these are for you, Brother Yahya. Our first question from an anonymous attendee, Assalamu alaikum. As we are trying to advance and augment Muslim rights as minorities, there will be pushback, as there will be critiques and reflections on non-Muslim treatment in Muslim majority lands. How do we ensure that we secure both Muslim and non-Muslim minority rights in their respective national homes?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is interesting. I'm going to slightly dodge this question, but for a very political reason. Okay, so I'll give you a real life example. I was asked to present on pluralism in the Muslim world and treatment of minorities in the Muslim world, and it was something that had been organized by a kind of Catholic network. And I said, look, I'm not working on that at the moment. What I am working on is Muslim minorities. So I submitted a paper called, Al-Muslim bi dhimmati kafir, that the Muslim is the dhimma of the non-believer, of the unbeliever. So a kind of role reversal. This is actually a principle within the qawaid of fiqh. So the thing is that it's a reversal, but that's actually, I think, a very useful point. Then we talk about the mistreatment of Muslim minorities, that becomes a generative discussion about the rights of all minorities, I hope. So I think that it's not an indulgence for us to think about this issue. In fact, this may be the grounds upon which the Rahmaniyya, the universal compassion of the Prophet, that we can manifest it and manifest that in extending our experience to others. But let's at least recognize we start with our own trauma and suffering. That is the seeds of our compassion. That's all I would suggest. I don't think it's a dodge. I think it's how we find ourselves. But the point is that Muslim minority status and Muslim suffering, it has no champion in the world. It has no champion, no big champion, no large champion. So who's going to speak up for them? So I'm happy to that we put some focus on that.
Would anybody else like to come in on that question? Any members of the panel, or indeed anybody else who is a panelist within the webinar today? No? Okay, let's go to our next question then, inshallah. Another question from an anonymous attendee. I have a question regarding building independent institutions. Regarding the building independent institutions point. That's an excellent recommendation. How would Muslim minorities build them when long-term funding issues could be a real problem to be independent, e.g. foreign companies or countries or rich Muslims who may donate with strings attached that may create similar problems to saving democracy from big business, that may create similar problems to the saving democracy from big business point, when many Muslim minorities may be interested in materialism more than community growth?
I think that, let me say that independence is relative, but it seems imperative to me that we need to find ways to core fund at least 5 sectors of minority life, worship, and ritual practice of community, like halal meat, education, philanthropy and social welfare, advocacy and representation, although less representation than before, more advocacy, and finally create media and creative. I think those 5 areas, they need some core funding, because what happens otherwise is that they get captured by the state, and therefore we can't articulate our own agenda. I'm not saying project funding could be a different thing. Project funding could be a different thing, but core funding, we need to find a way. And obviously, I'm sorry to keep going back to Britain, but that's the example that I know the best. Mosques, madrasas, and halal meat, for instance, they're all core funded, aren't they? But our education isn't, our advocacy and representation often isn't, and media and creative often isn't, or is not funded at all. So we can clearly see there are areas that need to be core funded, and I think that there's a way to get a combine between, if we look at best practice in places like Malaysia and Turkey, you can combine an operational business with a charitable arm or wing. Okay, so it's not quite a foundation, but it will be feeding into a charitable, like a social enterprise structure that we have in Britain. You can do that under British company law, but there are good models in places like Turkey and Malaysia where business are combined with community welfare projects. So I think we need to think about how we connect. Our traditional way was for people to raise money through ad hoc donation on Fridays, and another model could be a subscription model. The subscription model to support Islamic education, it worked extremely well in British India. It created a very independent network of madrasas, one of the most successful in the 20th century, basically, 19th and 20th century. So there are models out there that we can look at. So I think that in terms of like capture by big business, I think that's a question of governance and structure. So that's a question of the governance of foundations. But I don't think that's an impossible thing to resolve.
Okay, brilliant. So in the absence of any other questions, and a reminder that everyone is free to raise their hands. Dr.
Hafsa's got a...
We'll go straight to you, Dr. Hafsa.
Okay, thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum. Thanks everyone for your comments today. I have a question. I hope I can articulate it properly. Basically, I'm obviously very invested, as we all are, in this question of the post-nation and Muslim communities in these other countries. I'm also looking at Farzana's comment about whether we should really use the term minority and what that might mean. But Muslim communities in the West, in India and China, etc., they are dealing with two things, I think. One is efforts both by the state as well as other Muslims in those countries to domesticate Islam. And I think especially after 9/11, we really saw that. So how do you work around those within these communities who are so invested in creating an Indian Islam or an American Islam or a British Islam? And then the second, I think, is for so long, especially in our discussions about pan-Islamism in the colonial period and Muslims who kind of look beyond the nation, there was greater surveillance, a greater risk for that kind of activism or activity. And so how do we do this without, again, increasing state surveillance and backlash against Muslims who are able to think beyond the nation?
That's a great question. I mean, I should make clear, Dr. Hafsa, that in the report I don't use minorities as a normative term. It's a reality that we start from. But I say that ontologically we should consider ourselves part of the Ummah, but pragmatically we stand as minorities for so many reasons. It doesn't mean it's doing normative work, but it's where 1 in 5 Muslims stand. So I think that people get worried when you use minorities, but minority is actually, and also the other thing, as we say in the report, it's not just about number. It's also about the logic of the Westphalian nation-state order, but also of coloniality. The fact that you had a colonial rule in which the numerical majority were divided up into operational minorities, either as tribes, ethnicities, religions, define, divide, and rule. And that was the Muslim minority experience, really, in encountering European modernity. So the report has a critical dialogue with the term minority. It doesn't try to normalize minority as an unproblematic natural fact of political life. Far from it. So I just want to make you clear on that score. But I agree with you that the question about post-national politics, and I think I'm talking coming 20 years after the war on terror, I'm feeling quite positive in some ways that the attempt to create a domesticated Islam doesn't seem to have worked, despite enormous resources that have been thrown at such a project. It doesn't mean that it hasn't come without struggle. And, a huge amount of struggle. And we have become demoralized by that struggle. But nonetheless, I still see opportunities for us. And one of the opportunities, I think, is us to revive this concept of ummah and make it work for our generation and make it do new work. And as I said, that entails a critique, I think, of how we consider it to have been misused in our recent past. So with that critique, we need to go back to tradition and we need to revive it. And practically, we need to create, as I said at the end of my presentation, borderless ummatic networks like institutional exchanges and things like that between universities and between jamaats and you know, and so on, and youth exchanges and so on, not just through the digital. One of the written questions was through what is the impact of the internet on bordered thinking? Well, I think it's critical, obviously. I think the internet may be one of the major things killing off the idea of borders in the first place. So just as print revolutionized and created nationalism, this is what Benedict Anderson said, right, all those years ago, that print created nationalism. The internet, I think, recreates an unbordered world, I think. And the Ummah is one of those unbordered universal ideas in the world. And this is why I say in the report, I think it's a pluriversal world, because Muslims recognize there are other universalisms around. We may not agree with them, but they exist. We don't believe that there's only one universalism. But nonetheless, this is the internet, I think, will make the domestication of Islam very difficult. I think surveillance and backlash, again, I think that there's no easy answer for that, except to say we have to seek, make coalitions and alliances locally and globally to strengthen our position. There's no easy way around that. One has to pick one's battles as well. One can't take everything on at once. Obviously, there's a degree of political sagacity required to maneuver through this challenging terrain.
Would anybody else like to come in on that? I see Dr. Anjum. Dr. Fatah, we'll just come to you first and then go to Dr. Anjum. Go ahead.
I had more of a question, I guess, as a result of the response. I guess maybe this is a question more to theologians, or maybe Yahiba, you have maybe have some ideas. But when I was reading your report and there was a mention of not domesticating Islam, it just made me think about how. So when we think of sort of, let's say the 4 key imams and how they traveled around and how they were settled in particular societies and were understanding particular customs, right, which is one of the key facets used to determine, key aspects of Sharia. So it just makes me wonder, and of course, we didn't have the Westphalian conceptualization of nations at the time, but nonetheless, these imams were traveling, they were exposed to different customs and ideas and ways of being and living and so on and so forth. I guess my question is, so when we look at let's say our 4 key schools of thoughts and how they're confined to particular parts, I guess, would you say those imams were, I guess, domesticating it or in fact contextualizing it? How do we then differentiate between not domesticating Islam, but ensuring there is context? Because there are particular things that you and I understand about British Muslims that perhaps, I don't know, French Muslims won't understand about us and we won't understand about French or American Muslims. So I think, where's the fine line between domesticating or not domesticating and ensuring there is enough of a context for people to understand that, okay, this is specific to this area in the way perhaps our imams did historically. I guess, that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think this is to do with the relationship between deen and culture. So if Islam is universal, so within it has all human cultures could be part of it. And so I don't, in other words, I don't think there is such a thing as a Muslim who just has deen and no culture. In other words, to be authentically Muslim, it doesn't mean that you have to be decultured. You come decultured and you become rootless and you have nowhere to stand. You have no home. Of course, Muslims have homes. Of course, they have languages, histories, and so on, right? And they have attachment to place. I mean, these things are normal and natural, right? We all have biographies and ancestors and so on. So we're not, I don't believe that authentic Islam is deculturated Islam, you know, but what I would say is that the difference between that and domestication is the idea that actually there's only one way to belong and be in a particular territory. In other words, it's a kind of assimilationist logic. I would even call it, you know, the kind of the idea within liberalism, the only way to be authentically human is to be liberal, because if you're non-liberal, you're not an ethical agent. So the thing is I think this idea of a kind of restrictive diversity, which excludes the Muslim, is othered in a restrictive idea of pluralism, in which the Muslims get dehumanized. You know, that would be a form of domestication. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that, you know, we need to push back against that and say, actually, you know, we want to talk back to that. Yes, we're happy to be in context, happy to be in context and do more than just, you know, we want to do more than just subsist or survive. We want to thrive and we want to contribute. You know, so the report is making arguments for conditions for thriving, not just for survival. Obviously, survival, if survival is at stake, you want to ensure that. Obviously, for some minorities, it is a question of survival at the moment. But what are the conditions for thriving? Is obviously. So I hope that's clear. I hope that's kind of a clear enough kind of answer.
I think we'll go to Sister Linda for her input on that. I think this point around indigenization, I guess, is what she also spoke about during her response.
Yeah.
And then we'll come to you, Dr. Angela. Go ahead, Linda.
Yes, thank you. Exactly. So that was exactly my point that I was also trying to make. I mean, like this issue of when you have one community that is sort of represented as the epitome of domestication of the Islam for that national context. And that particular way of living Islam, as you, Brother Yahya, also mentioned, is seen as the only way of doing things within the expectations of what the majority population has towards Muslims in terms of integration, which is actually assimilation, as you mentioned. Now, that is problematic exactly because of the reason that it's used by the state, by the governors, as well as by the public, but also the community itself who has domesticated Islam. To sort of like create this anti-Muslim racist, like another kind of a discourse, right? And I think that your differentiation between domestication and contextualization is really good, because the concept of urf that is there, we all have to, like, this is an Islamic concept, the urf, and how we contextualize Islam in each national or, let's say, cultural context as such. But I think that the rest of the Muslim minority community in the country has a big problem when they are trying to thrive in their diversity, but there is this one way of Islam that is imposed on them. Let's say the German Islam, the French Islam. There's a very specific example, for instance, from France, like at the moment, like a state kind of like made Islam, and everybody should adhere to that. So I think that is highly problematic, and I don't think that we're addressing this enough, because we're all the time, when we're talking about anti-Muslim racism, we're looking at how the problems are created from outside, but we are not addressing the issues that are coming from inside our own communities within this discourse.
But I think you have to do both. You're sort of setting them up as a zero-sum game, and that's exactly what I think we shouldn't be doing. Because if we say that we can't, our politics finishes outside of national, is bordered. So our political concern and our ethics is bordered. You know, I don't believe that makes any sense in a highly connected, globalized world in which an ummah is one of those forms of universalism. You know, I think this idea that their intention is actually a nationalist idea. And that's exactly what I'm trying to interrogate with a kind of a vision of post-nationalism. So I'm not sure we agree on this, but I would also say that about indigeneity. Indigeneity is a movable concept. So what was indigenous 200 years ago, the idea of the indigenous changes. So I would say that when states, if they become post-national, they would have a more capacious idea of what is indigenous, because it wouldn't be linked to the concept of ethno-nationalism or ethno-majoritarianism, which would look askance at cultural diversity within that territory. So if states became post-national, they would have a more capacious idea of the indigenous. So Urf, what is Urf? The idea of Urf would become more capacious. And it seems to me that it's in our interest to argue for that kind of politics that is less, ethnocentric and culturally bound. I think it's in our interest, and and it's the right thing to do, and we should make that case. Even if we get some kind of backlash, we still have to make that case, and we then make alliances with people who want to make that case. The Ummah is always at the point. Somebody else asked in the chat about, we gave the example of Albania, how Islamic relief was being portrayed as in Albania was being portrayed as a kind of Arab cultural imperialism. He said, despite the fact they're acting with a great deal of tact and sensitivity and so on and so forth. And I think that nobody says that rejoining the Ummah together in a world of nation states and moving towards post-national politics is going to be easy. It's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of dialogue and a lot of patience and a lot of effort. I don't see any shortcuts. The only thing we have to ask ourselves is, are we ready to make that effort? I think. Are we ready to make a commitment to the Ummah and not just to our national community, not just to our own minority? This is the thing, we have to make that effort. And make time and resources for it. That's what I'm suggesting.
Okay, I'll come to you, Dr. Anjem.
Okay, Bismillah, alhamdulillah. Such a wonderful discussion. Thank you very much, Yahya. I'm in awe of the report in many ways. It was very inspiring to me when you shared it with me a couple of months ago. And I've been thinking about it ever since. And your presentation, in fact, raises even more points that the way you articulate many of those things. I wanted to bring up 2 points and perhaps point toward a solution. First, I wanted to say that what I hear Sister Linda say is really the need perhaps to classify the kind of intra-ummatic problems one faces between within the politics of indigenization and foreignness. For instance, it could be that Muslims, for example, who want to wear hijab or keep beards or what have you, are being marginalized or attacked in the name of another part of the Ummah that has reconciled or gotten over these requirements, right? Now, what is the obligation, if you will, ummatic obligation on the part of the Muslims who are being targeted? And they, for what they believe to be the right thing by their faith. And I think that the politics of culturalism or multiculturalism or pluralism simply does not give us any guidance on this. This is why I think it's important to have the ummatic must be first and foremost Islamic, right? It must first and foremost be Quranic and prophetic, as well as ethical, so that, for instance, sometimes the Quran and Sunnah can be wielded for either direction, but the ethical imperative to side with the oppressed, the weak, may give us some direction. For example, in the United States, we face this problem between African American Muslims and South Asian and Arab Muslims. The latter tend to be more well off, but their mosques often tend to be more exclusivist, sometimes class clubs that keep other people out, not so much through explicit regulations, but the way that they are built and the way that they're, the conventions, for example, that you find of American Muslims happen in five-star hotels, whereas conventions of African American Muslims, when they start to focus on just their community, they're very sensitive to the fact that many people cannot pay $300 a night to stay. So there are all these kinds of situations that have an ethical component that is not directly religious. So I think that there is a religious component, right? For example, when it comes to the question of hijab, the ummatic discourse has to point in a direction rather than simply saying, well, be ummatic, right? So the ummatic therefore has to also be Quranic. And one of the things that I think in your report I felt could be highlighted is the role of the ulama and the role of ummatic ulama, let us say, because ulama, of course, themselves could be split, but the role of the centrality of the Quran. In particular, I'm saying Quran and then the Sunnah. Nevertheless, those are the tensions that I hear Sister Linda and others point out, and I think that they do need further thinking. The second point I wanted to raise is it possible that given the structure of the geopolitical structure of the world, that by emphasizing ummatic minorities in the current world order, where ummatic majorities are being controlled by either puppets or dictators supported directly by Western elite, with whom often Western Muslims, share platforms, sometimes sympathies, certainly cultural affiliations. It seems to me that this ummatic minority Islam diaspora Islam can become the normative Islam, right? And we could take advantage of being, of the privilege of being a minority, but at the same time, we in fact are possibly part of an imperialist outlook, unless we are also ummatically grounded. So I think that dimension of the inequality of the world, of which you are absolutely aware, and you mentioned colonialism and very clearly, and I want to point just to one aspect of that, which is that, is it possible that this diaspora Islam becomes the norm? And what happens? What is lost when this Islam that is re-articulated, becomes so powerful that our theologians, our speakers, our successful, the voices from the West, the celebrities, begin to define Islam not only for the margins, but for the center as well. To give you an example, when bin Bayas, President Obama, in one of his speeches, was made to insert the name of Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, making him an overnight celebrity in the Muslim world. That is the kind of power that these minorities can wield.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a danger, and it is something that I allude to in the report when I talk about the development of a kind of abject theology, a theology of objection, where the state is allowed to exercise, arbitrary control over fundamental rights. And so, that is mentioned in the report. And I think that, you know, what I tried to frame in the report was an idea of virtuous politics of ummah is mutual empowerment. So in other words, neither of the minority Muslim world over the majority Muslim world or the majority Muslim world over the minority Muslim world. And I'm not trying here to say that is the preeminent dynamic within the ummah. This report is just focused, this is a strand in our work, and we're focused on the Muslim minorities because they deserve attention. But with regard, when you think about Muslim minorities, and again, just to go back to what Hafsa said, this is not a normative concept for us. And it's not an unproblematic analytic concept, but nonetheless, it's a kind of a reality for 1 in 5 Muslims around the world. So for me, yeah, definitely, virtuous politics of ummah has to be about mutual empowerment between these two spheres. And so the danger, I mean, to be honest, I see the dangers largely the other way. The danger is largely the other way, that sort of Islamic soft power has been pushed by certain Muslim nations, and that has affected how Islamic networks have developed in Muslim minorities in the 20th and 21st centuries. It's affected their theology, their jurisprudence, how they organize their institutions, and it's been securitized since the war on terror, you know, but it goes back decades before that. And so I'm not saying there's such a thing. I'm not calling for independence of minorities. I'm talking for, I'm advocating for a mature relationship where minorities talk back, and we can, but not in a defiance, but in a dialogue where we say, these are our needs, our cause is ummatic, these are the things we might need from you, what can you help us with, and vice versa. There's a mutuality envisaged in this on the basis of a kind of fairness, on the principle of fairness. So I agree that we have to be alive to a vicious politics of ummah, which ensures that part of the ummah will always lose in order for another part of the ummah to win. And so this is a very simple definition, I know, but is based on the idea that the ummah is a body. It's a body, and if one part of the ummah is affected, it affects the rest. This comes in the hadith literature. So for me, virtuous politics of ummah has to ensure that the whole body is whole, is healthy, and is thriving. And it's not that we have to cut off our hand or arm to save the rest of the body. This is not what we're saying. I hope that kind of answers your question, but obviously it's an ethical practice, isn't it? And it's a self-critical practice that we have to engage in.
I want to say that I think that it is absolutely true, and your report, I think, does really raise the bar in how we think about minorities, no doubt about that, and our own role. And I think that the solution that you propose, and one that can be extrapolated out of your report, is that there needs to be a deliberate discourse of the ummah but what the shape of that discourse is, right? That is still something that we must actively participate in, and we must make sure that the shape of that discourse is Quranic and ethical. But one wonder that I wanted to share with you for future conversations is that to place minorities living under non-Muslim regimes at the same footing as Darul Islam, right? For instance, for 1,300 years of fiqh, this would look very strange. This would look like you're comparing somebody who is living in Darul Islam and giving them the same rights and responsibilities as those who are doing something that's perhaps questionable. Most of the fuqaha will say, well, you can't live outside Darul Islam. So there is a grading within the tradition of who comes first. And we must wrestle with that. And not to suggest that your report had to do it. I think that you raise questions that enable us to ask those questions.
Can I be provocative, Dr. Ofemir, and ask you, do you think that somehow, because of colonialism, because of Western modernity, because of the Westphalian order, that forces us to maybe break with that tradition? Because so many, you know, if 400 million plus Muslims are living in these circumstances and there's no return to Dar al-Islam for them, may I provocatively ask, should we think about, you know, a political theology for these 1 in 5 Muslims? Or are we bound to only consider, even in the minority context, the political theology for the 4 out of 5 Muslims who live as majorities?
Well, it's a great question, indeed, a great provocation. And I would say that Darul Islam and Darul Harb dichotomy can certainly be revised, but Darul Islam, I argue, cannot be eliminated unless we mean to eliminate Sharia as a legal domain. Meaning that you cannot say that for any legal system, if you want to understand Sharia and as a legal system as opposed to merely ethical information, which is how we treat it typically in the West and in the modern world. But the reason why classical fiqh couldn't do that is because Sharia actually determined rights and responsibilities, and therefore you have to know what the jurisdiction was. And in the 20th century world, we do that aspirationally. But I think that if you say that we simply get rid of that, any remnant, any version of that difference, then it is kind of like saying that American law can live except in no land, right? All countries in the world are American law. It's like listening to American music is not the same as being subjects of American law and having those rights. Islam is not just listening to Islamic music, but also living by those duties and rights. And therefore, there has to be Darul Islam. And if it doesn't exist now, for any faqih to do their work with any seriousness, it has to exist at least aspirationally.
But what about the Dar al-Harb part of that equation? How would you?
I think that for the work that's been done there and that needs to be done more is work by scholars like Sheikh al-Qaradawi, who speaks of Dar al-Da'wah. And the fiqh of minorities, which has been developed and has been criticized, I think often rightly, certainly is onto something when dealing with these questions. So I think that living in Dar al-Da'wah and thinking of a more or less permanent place for Muslim minorities without requiring hijrah, but also being discursive and clear about what are the conditions in which hijrah is not an obligation, for instance. What are the conditions in which Muslims living in other minority regions can be normalized or semi-normalized, right? The way it was done, for example, to give you one quick possible way of thinking about it, is the way that Russian and Ottoman Muslims continue to live in large numbers in each other's territories, but in fact were considered subjects of the other sovereigns. So Orthodox Christians were subjects of Tsar while living in Ottoman lands, and the other way around. Muslims were subjects of the Ottoman Empire. So there were mutual treaties like that in the past. What happens in the future, we don't know. But I'm just saying that eliminating that distinction, which many Western Muslims often want to do, to me is like saying that the Sharia should become a song and no more.
Yeah, I mean, I that's why I talked about a double political theology, because which sounds like a weird idea, but I don't think by that proposal I would say that one is doing away with Dar al-Islam. So trying to say, is that possible, or is that actually a kind of like a double think that would be injurious to a normative Islamic political theology? This is kind of the question I'm asking. You seem to be saying that it would be, that to think of it even would be injurious.
I think this is for another colloquium, inshallah.
Okay. Nice dodge.
It's a big question, but I wanted to see if anybody else had thoughts on those related issues, thoughts expressed there by Dr. Anjum, Brother Yahya, any of the other panelists. Okay, well, if not, we have just about 5-10 minutes left. We had a couple of questions. One, I think the previous conversation just answered. So I'll come to our last question, which is for you, Brother Yahya, but of course, Dr. Siddiq and Sister Linda, please feel free to give your input. This is from Zishan Mahmoud. Given that a lot of academic discourse and public policies revolve around the figure of the Muslim, I cannot but help wonder about the potential cons of invoking Muslims as akin to the Jew, Black people, the working class, etc. In other words, there remains a danger in allowing the Muslim name to become entrapped within constructed sociological constructs and their assumptions that may or may not actually have anything to do with Islam. The same goes for the Ummah. How will our constant and renewed invocation of this Quranic term / concept not become something akin to give a prominent parallel to a Marxist call for the workers of the world to unite and establish a communist utopia?
Great question.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's in the slide presentation I gave. I think we have to do two things at once. I think we need to recognize Ummah as a normative concept. So Ummah is an ethical concept, it's an embodied concept, it's a Quranic concept. And we have to uphold justice, we have to be even-handed, we have to believe in one God, and we have to enjoin right and forbid wrong. So I think at its core, it's unbounded ethical vision. So I think we have to keep returning to that to keep ourselves in check. But I wanted to also suggest that it could do work as an analytical concept. In other words, let me ask you a question of what does an ummatic mobilization in the world today look like? What are the conditions for a success? What are the conditions that cause it to fail? So why is it that some causes that look like they should be ummatic causes aren't, and they're relatively neglected? Kashmir has been a crisis for the same time that Palestine has been a crisis, or nearly the same amount of time. And but Kashmir is really nowhere in the radar of ummatic politics compared to Palestine. And I'm not trying to suggest it's a competition. I'm saying it's also an analytical issue. It's an analytical issue for us to understand when politics of Ummah has purchase and when it doesn't. And so that's an analytical exercise. I believe we should ask that question. It's not that we just do analysis of nationalism, analysis of ethnopolitics, analysis of racism. We need analysis of Ummah to move from the normative to, move between the analytical and the normative and back and forth in order. We need the analytical in order to have purchase to give the normative purchase in the world as it is, and not just talk about our ideals without thinking about how we bring them into practice. To go back to Siddiq Hamid's point, how do you bring your normative values into bear upon the world? I am going to quote Marx here, The point isn't just to understand the world, it is to change it. That's when Marx was sounding at his most Islamic, if I can say that, So in other words, with the normative is to bring about change in the world. And so, but I do think we need to see Ummah as its potential as an analytic concept for that very reason. I don't think it's a clever way of thinking about workers of the world unite. I think it remains an ethical concept which is going to challenge Muslims themselves to live up to its values, those who make up the Ummah. It's not about the Ummah right or wrong. This is the whole point. It cannot be, I'm with my solidarity is unconditional. No, of course not. It's tamed or it's limited by normative justice of values and ethics, Islamic values and ethics. So I think we always have to have this self-critical reflection when we call for solidarity. It's not solidarity without ethics, obviously. So I think this is the horizon in which we seek solidarity, its limitation, if you like.
Okay, brilliant. Sister Linda, do you want to come in on that?
Yes. So when you are, Brother Yahya, suggesting analyzing Ummah, I can see myself totally having like a research project starting from my own country and just qualitatively looking into how the Muslims in Finland, for instance, understand Ummah, how do they relate to Ummah. But that would be a qualitative project for itself. But then again, the question is, I would never be able to reach all the Muslims in the country and actually ask them about this issue. I will never be able to reach everybody who is identified, let's say in the census. Actually, we don't have census on religious basis, but if hypothetically you would have everybody who is identified as a Muslim, and then reach them and check their ummatic mentality, so to say, because I think there is lots of Muslims around in our contexts, geographical and national contexts, who identify maybe as a Muslim, but because they are cultural Muslims, let's say, for instance, and they don't have any kind of a spiritual, let's say, relation to the ethical concept of Ummah that you just mentioned. So I think it's very difficult, even if I'm thinking about how to mobilize the Ummah. Who am I trying to mobilize? Who are those Muslims who are ready to actually then be included? So I think that is something we are lacking of, especially, I think, the mentality of relating to the Ummah. And maybe that is a question for Islamic education in the schools, in the madrasas, for starting to raise awareness among the children first, and adults, of course, so that we change the mentality from there and then work bottom up, so to say. Yeah, that's just my 2 cents for that.
Thank you.
Any final words, Brother Yahya?
No, I'm all talked out. I'm a bit unwell. I've got a bit of a cold, to be honest with you. I don't know how I've got through this. I was very trepidatious about this this session with such fine minds of the Ummah gathered together. So I just feel very grateful that you very kindly all came out tonight or this morning or whatever time it is to debate and discuss this. And I hope it's a start of many conversations, inshallah.
Sure.
Okay, unfortunately, you can see we have one more question, but we're all out of time. So Dr. Anjum, I'll just hand it over to you for some closing remarks before we wrap up.
Okay, yes, so I'll make it very brief, inshallah. Thank you very much, Brother Yahya, for this really great treat, I think, for the Ummatics Institute, which I want to take a minute to talk about. This has been a really, it's a great model for how to move forward for an institution like ours. We feel that Ayan Institute that you represent is a great is a sister institution, one that we hope that there will be many more in different places where people from the Ummah from different perspectives can participate. I wanted to take a minute to talk about the Ummatics Institute. Our website has been launched. Please go visit it, register yourself, and reach out to us if there is any way that you can participate. It is currently focused on academics and ulama, but we are expanding and increasingly will have more and more ways to contribute to the Ummah and to the Ummatic discourse. Many of the questions that have been raised here, the tensions between indigeneity and foreignness, the question of Darul Islam and Darul Da'wah. These are questions that we believe are best answered by an entire generation of Muslims today. We do share in Brother Yahya Bert's optimism and hopefulness as a sign of faith, as a requirement of faith in some respects. The Prophet ﷺ used to dislike all superstition except for if something were optimistic. He would see that as a sign from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's optimism and of course hopefulness, raja, that comes from Allah. And so we do see great and tremendous odds set up against the Muslims everywhere. I think that what Brother Yahya's presentation has done is to remind us that we can reframe, reprogram our thinking, we rearrange the furniture of our minds, the way we think about the world, that it is possible for us to think umatically and act umatically, feel umatically against all odds. And we believe that it's what we are trying to set up is the work of a generation, not something that one person, one scholar, one genius, or one institute can do. But we have hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the same way that Muslims in Mecca did, grounded in faith and grounded in the practice of nasiha, as the Prophet ﷺ said, in the deen and nasiha, religion is sincere advice, first to God, his book, his messenger, and then to leaders and ordinary Muslims. This is the task, the mission of the Ummatic Institute. We invite all of you who are inclined to do Ummatic thinking, either at an academic level, activist level, to please join us. There are many ways in which you could join us, which you could reach out to any of us, myself, Hannah, Uthman, Badr, or anyone else, to tell us about how you might want to participate. So thank you very much, Hannah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anjem, and to all of our presenters today, Brother Yahya, Dr. Fatima, who unfortunately had to leave a little early, Sister Linda, and Dr. Siddiq, of course. As Dr. Anjem said, please do visit our new website and make sure that you are subscribed to our email mailing list to get all updates about our upcoming events and articles, inshallah. You can also follow us on social media, on Facebook and on Twitter for, again, those updates. Thank you, everybody, for coming today and for giving us your time. Until the next time, Assalamu alaikum.